All right, so if you guess no, you are correct. So here in Georgia, because of BRRETA, the Brokerage Relationship and Real Estate Transactions Act, we only owe the duties that are set forth in our brokerage engagement, such as the one that we're going to look at today. And BRRETA, one thing it does is it specifically states that we do not owe a fiduciary duty to our clients. Now, so what I do to access the buyer brokerage agreement is I go to FMLS.com and I'm going to log in to their system. And up at the top under products, you will see Remind Docs Plus. That's actually the one that we are going to go in today, is Remind Docs Plus. Now, I've already done that here. Once you access Remind Docs Plus, here I'm going to back out just a little bit. And my page is going to look a little bit different than yours. My dashboard is going to look a little bit different than yours on the broker level. But ultimately, you can create a new transaction, or you can view transactions that you have already created. And I am a big fan of creating practice folders. I do that myself as a broker. We recommend that our new agents do that as well. That way, whenever we do have a buyer or a seller that we're working with, we're already familiar with how Remind works, or whatever system that you plan to use. That's a system that you want to practice in. Now, what I did was I created a file, and it's called Buyer Practice. Now, I went ahead and pulled in the buyer brokerage agreement, and I pulled in Protect Yourself When Buying Real Estate, and also the ABCs of agency. Now, how I did that is up under Forms. If you click on that, it's going to open up this pop-up window. Now, the first tab, though, that it shows us when we select this pop-up says Forms, but I actually want us to go one tab over. Now, we can certainly search if we know, for example, that the buyer brokerage agreement is F110. We could pull it up individually, but we've made things a little bit easier for you. So one tab over on the left, you will see Packages. And if you scroll down to Solid Source Realty or Solid Source Realty Georgia, you will see every folder, every package that we've already created for you. So for example, I can go ahead and select on GAR buyer package, and I can see all of the commonly used forms for buyer are already going to be here for me. So we just did this to make your lives a little bit easier. For example, if this was a referral, oftentimes it's hard to remember what forms do I really need for a referral. Right here in the GAR referral package, we've got both the referral authorization form and the broker-to-broker referral agreement. And I simply went ahead and pulled those in. And as you pull those documents in, they're already going to be in what we call, or what FMLS calls, smart forms. Now, smart forms are wonderful because all we have to do is click in the fillable blanks and go ahead and type in that item. So if you guys are ready, we're going to dive in. Now, the GAR buyer brokerage is only 7 pages, and the blanks are only going to be on 3 of those pages. The key terms and conditions are all going to be on this very first page. So most of our brain power and our efforts in filling out the agreement is going to be right here on the very first page. And I'm going to zoom in just a little bit for you guys. And one thing I am going to point out, kind of going back to the conversation that we started about BRRETA, and it references it right off the bat here on the buyer brokerage agreement. So it says state law prohibits broker from representing buyer as a client without first entering into a written agreement with the buyer under OCGA 106A1. So a buyer is only our client once they have signed a buyer brokerage agreement. And that's how we establish that client relationship, is through a brokerage engagement such as this one. So with these key terms and conditions, the first one that we have the ability to fill out is going to be the term. So this is going to be the date that we want the buyer brokerage agreement to go ahead and start, typically going to be the same day that we are filling it out, that we're going to send it over to the client for their signature. So in our example, we're going to go ahead and choose today, which is going to be August the 2nd. Now, we also indicate an end term. Now, we always want to have an ending term in all of our brokerage agreements. It is a requirement in our license law that we include a fixed date of expiration. So let's just say that this buyer brokerage agreement is going to run for 90 days. So I'm simply going to choose a date in the future. And I'm just going to randomly choose a date for example purposes today. So we've got it starting on August the 2nd and running through October the 25th. This is 100% negotiable in all of your brokerage engagements. Usually 2 or 3 months is kind of what we're seeing right now, but there is no rule that says it has to be a certain number of days. It could be as short as 30 days, or it could be as long as the parties agree to. Now, moving on to section 3, the agreement talks about agency and brokerage. Now, GAR's approach on all of their brokerage engagements is to list every type of brokerage relationship that is available in Georgia. And it simply asks us to select the one that we do not offer. So dual agency, and I know this one's already selected because it was in the package. Dual agency is the only type of agency that we do not offer. And dual agency would be the same exact agent representing both the buyer and the seller as a client in that same transaction. Now in 3B, I would go ahead and select does not, but it's truly not applicable if dual agency is not something that is going to be offered. A common question that can come up is, what if it's my listing and a buyer is interested in placing an offer and they do not have an agent that they're working with? Is that a buyer that I can work with because I know that Solid Source does not offer dual agency? And the answer to that question is yes. We just wouldn't want to establish a client relationship with the buyer. We would just need to explain to that buyer that the seller is our client. They are who we represent in that transaction, and we're happy to work with them as a customer. So quickly, that varies significantly from designated agency, which would be the same real estate company involved, but it would be a different agent with each party. For example, if I was representing the seller and Julie was representing the buyer through a buyer brokerage agreement, and we were both with the same Solid Source company, that would be an example of designated agency. All right, you guys are doing awesome. Now, section 4 was updated in the past couple years with GAR, and it references the commission obligations of the buyer at closing. Now, it's important to remember that buyer or seller, either one, can pay the broker's real estate commission at closing. This is 100% negotiable. If a commission is listed here, let's just say, for example, that 3% is what the buyer agreed to pay upon closing of a property, and the seller is paying 3%, they're offering 3% to the cooperating broker working with the buyer. In that instance, the buyer would not owe us anything because it was 3% would be the commission obligation, but 3% is what we actually received. Because this language here right above it, just so this all makes sense, says the buyer agrees to pay broker the commission at the closing entered into during the term of this agreement minus any commission paid by the broker by either the seller's broker or the seller. So if we mix that story up just a little bit and we say that, well, the buyer agreed to pay, let's say it's 3%, but the seller only paid 2%. Only 2% was offered as a co-op. In that event, the difference would be 1%, and that would be the only amount that the buyer would actually be responsible for at closing. Now, when it comes to separate commission on leases, generally putting an amount here is certainly not going to hurt anything. Now, if it's a buyer that feels like, well, there's just absolutely no way I'm going to lease property, that's not what I'm looking for. But if you feel like there's a chance they may, certainly feel free to go ahead and put in an amount. And it says as follows. Generally, what we are going to state is within 1 week of the property being leased, within 1 week of the signing of the lease agreement. And when it comes to protected period, and this is actually the last blank, believe it or not, for us to fill in on the buyer brokerage agreement, the length of time that we would be protected in the event the buyer actually purchases a property that we introduce them to during the term of our agreement. Now, again, this is 100% negotiable. So that's actually not very many, but that is all of the blanks, at least on the very first page. There's only 2 other pages in the buyer brokerage that have any fields to fill out at all. The remaining pages of the agreement are what we refer to as boilerplate language. It is super important for us as real estate professionals to go through and read all of it. And absolutely, we encourage buyers to go through and read all of it as well. And when it comes to exhibits, are there any specific exhibits that we recommend? All of GAR's brochures are wonderful. Everything from the ABCs of agency to protect yourself when buying a home. These are wonderful brochures. The one, Protect Yourself When Buying a Home, discusses the importance of a home inspection. It also talks about wire fraud. So while these aren't required to mark any, the more that you can give the buyer, the better. So I do recommend that one. Lead-based paint is a requirement by the EPA. So needs change. The buyer today may have a desire to purchase new construction, or maybe properties that have been built in the last 10 years or so. But you never know. Sometimes those older homes have been remodeled, renovated, and it could spark the interest of your buyer. So no harm in go ahead and presenting them with a lead-based pamphlet from the very beginning. The more that information that you give them, the more you're helping to educate them. And generally no special stipulations for a buyer brokerage agreement. And then on the very last page, this is the signature page. Super important, you guys, to include not only your name and license number, but also the company name and license number. And go ahead and get at least an email and a phone number for your client. And then you always want to make sure that a copy of the agreement has been provided to all the buyers, and the broker and you maintain a copy for 3 years. The Real Estate Commission does require that we maintain documents for 3 years.